Hello, welcome to another episode of Uncommon Sensibilities. Today is part 2 in the 3-part China series. If you haven't had the chance to yet, go back and watch part 1 before you get into today's video. I'll put a link right here. In that video, I built a case for why the current trade situation with China is probably not actually a trade war. And I'm willing to bet that it's not for the reasons you might think. On that note, in today's video, I want to uncover some of the kind of black box mysteries around the economic conditions in China, point to a few of the historical elements of China's rise to becoming the second largest economy in the world, and use our own history here in the United States as a context for comparison to perhaps have a better understanding of what path China may go in the future and how they may impact the United States. Most importantly though, these kinds of conditions that may arise are going to have implications for you, for your finances, for your portfolio. So that's what I really want to focus on, because we want to be able to position ourselves to ignore the mainstream noise, all of the fear-mongering and nonsense that you're being preached by those who are profiting from keeping your attention. I'd rather have your attention for an hour, but give you the kind of information that'll last you a lifetime. So right up next, we'll get into it. First things first, let's cover something that I have been hearing on and off now, really since the start of my career. In my early years in financial planning, something that just kept coming up over and over, and it's probably because so many people were asking about this, is what's the deal with China owning so much of the U.S. governmental debt, and what kind of implications are associated there? There's always been this belief that China controls America simply because they are the holders of the majority share of U.S. issued debt. So I think to really crack this egg open and look at the contents inside here, let's first make a distinction. Debt and deficit. These are terms today in 2019, and you're going to be hearing it so much more as we get into the election cycle. Starting up at the end of 2019 and through the year 2020. But debt and deficit are two terms you're going to be hearing a lot about, and I want to make a clear distinction. The debt and the deficit are two very different things. They are not mutually exclusive of one another, but they are very different, and a lot of people mix them up. So when you hear, let's say, a politician or an economist or whoever it may be talking about the federal deficit, okay, let's be very clear that the federal deficit is the imbalance between income and expenditure in the most simple form. A deficit would be, what is your income, and then how much does your family spend? And that's not just spending on needs, it's spending on needs, wants, wishes, the types of things that, impulse buys, whatever it is. But the fact of the matter is if your family household income, after taxes, your cleared income to home is $100,000 a year, but your family is spending between mortgage and potential car payments, interest on loans that you've already taken out, plus the types of things like food and entertainment, whatever it is. If those all add up in that given year that you have $100,000 coming in to $120,000, you have a $20,000 deficit. Now, most American households fill that deficit by a credit card. Maybe it's a home equity loan. They end up borrowing money to fill that deficit. But I mentioned that one of the components to those expenditures might be interest that you're paying on your debts. Well, if your deficit's $20,000 and you add $20,000 more debt in a given year, you now have a larger interest that you're having to pay on that money in the future year. So your deficit will begin to grow even if all other expenditures and incomes stay identical. because of the fact that you're borrowing money, and that's to assume that we are in a rate environment of any kind of interest rate. And if it's going to be a credit card, I assure you, it will not be a negative interest rate. You're going to be paying interest, okay? So deficits feed debts. They make debts larger every year because that deficit has a cost. Now, I'm going to have to go ahead and break the parallels between the personal household and a country, because one thing a personal household can't do is, let's say, print money. They have to earn the money. They have to exchange hours of life in exchange for income, because that's ultimately what a job is of any kind. In today's modern world with fiat currencies, which by the way means a currency that's backed by nothing more than good faith in a government. It's not like there is a gold reserve backing the dollar, where there can only be as much dollar as there is gold in reserves. A central bank can effectively print money, or what we can do in the case of the US government is they can borrow money by issuing debt. So now when we look at this and we say, okay, the government's issuing debt to fill the deficit each and every year, and they're issuing it based on an interest rate. They're paying interest on it. Most people start, this is where the panic starts, even before you bring China into the picture, because they say, we can see the debt spiral that households go into, where they borrow on top of borrow on top of borrow, and next thing you know, the interest payments are the only thing they can afford based on their income. So they're not actually paying down the principal, but then potentially taking more loan, and next thing you know, the interest begins to eat the borrower because they can't pay down the principal. They never get out of debt, and that spiral takes them into perpetuity. Okay. On a governmental side, the debt spiral is a bit more gray. There's a lot more gray area. It's not as simple and clean cut as it gets with personal finance. But when they go and they issue this debt, when it comes to things like GDP, if your economy is growing, it's not only making money, but it is making money at a faster rate, or making more money per year each year, you're able to offset some of that interest. And that's where the Federal Reserve and a lot of this attention that's paid, a lot of people think that the attention paid to the Federal Reserve right now is built on this notion of the Federal Reserve having dropped rates because of the Great Recession, and they artificially suppressed those rates through the quantitative easing programs, leaving 2008, 9, 10, and they finally began raising rates during the Trump presidency, so only within the past 2.5 years. The attention on the Fed is, yes, due in part to that, but it's also due in part to the notion that this federal debt, and this is where politicians they're not going to want to tread into this very dangerous territory. The federal debt as an instrument for policy making and policy adherence, it is becoming a controller unto itself as far as how the Fed, or the power that the Fed wields, how it can affect the overall economic development or contraction that the United States sees, and thereby, as we've seen just within the past 20 years, thereby massively influencing the rest of the world because of the economic power and influence that the United States holds. So as the US government's issuing this debt, the ace in the pocket that they have is that control over the rates. And just last year, the Treasury began issuing a 2-month bond. And there used to be no such thing. And that's a very curious development when you start to see new instruments being offered. And that is, in my opinion, a clear signal to the markets that seems to be getting ignored, that there's an awareness of the control over those short-term rates and how it affects the overall debt of the country. And there's a active step being taken to potentially manipulate the circumstances in a favorable fashion. That's never going to be talked about because of the complexity of it on your mainstream news, Because at the end of the day, again, they want to keep the attention of people to get you through a commercial. That's where they make money. They do not make money giving you good information. So let's unwind and go back now to talking about the outstanding debt. And then we're going to feather China into the conversation here to address that main concern of whether or not China controls America by owning so much of that debt or being the largest lender to the United States. We know coming out of the Great Recession, the banking collapse, the 2006, 7, 8, 9. I like to open that window up because if you want to really include the implications associated to the real estate market, going back to 2006 is really where we need to start looking at that entire circumstance and the play out. Okay. Because of how we've constructed our economy, for better or worse, and I'm an avid believer that it's for the worse. But regardless, the way we've constructed our economy and the way that we've constructed our system, we allow for what is deemed to be monetary policy. Monetary policy is effectively controlled by, manipulated by, and in the hands of the Federal Reserve, the Fed. In contrast, the notion of fiscal policy by and large falls in the hands of Congress. So we've got an institution that is fundamentally flawed, a Federal Reserve, and then we have an institution that is inherently flawed, not by design, but due to the types of individuals who seek control in these chambers that we call Congress. They're not exactly who would be best serving the United States, because more often than not they're self-serving individuals who lack the fundamental understanding of these very decisive concepts and the decisions that are made around it. But fiscal policy is raising money and spending money. Monetary policy is controlling the ease of access to money. So if you make money easier to access, that would be lowering interest rates. As the Federal Reserve controls the monetary policy, the ease of access to money, they kept money very easy for quite a long time. We know that the United States, in terms of not only our policy decisions, but our economic strength and economic well-being, has a tremendous effect on the global economic landscape due to our size, our power, our strength, our diversity. Okay. If rates have been kept so low here, and if we went through the Great Recession that we did, and we know that the rest of the global economy went through its numerous iterations of some type of either recession or significant market correction or depression. All different countries had their own version, but by and large, the world as a whole, because everything is so relative, the world as a whole was doing worse than they had been in, let's say, 2004. Okay. So having that monetary policy in the position that it was, in other words, making it very easy to borrow money, the Fed kept rates very low. And the market rates, because of expectations for the future, didn't go up very much because they can the Fed only controls the overnight lending rate, how easy money is to access for banks. So however easy it is for them, they would theoretically translate that into the markets, or the markets in anticipation of what future may be in store is going to adjust accordingly. And we saw that by and large the markets felt as though it's not probable that we will end up seeing higher rates in the future. So the short end of the yield curve, or the overnight lending rate, stayed low, and then everything up the ladder all the way up to those 30-year treasuries stayed pretty low. And then the ripple or the echo occurs into the global space, and then things stayed pretty low just about everywhere, and in some cases so low that it went negative, and then you ended up seeing countries that were in negative interest rate space on their federal debt or their borrowing, to the point where if you think about what that means, they're not paying money to borrow, others are paying them. Kind of a funny concept to think about. But if we just say, for simplicity's sake again here, everything's low around the world. Okay. Now let's turn the tables. Let's take our shoes off as Americans and let's go put on the shoes of China. China is in a position where they have an unbelievable rate of economic growth. Initially spurred by let's just say a break in communism, but not a destruction of communism. By and large, in the 70s and 80s, there was a significant shift in the way that the communistic approach was employed across the nation, and it allowed for this kind of pseudo free market, and I can't even say free market, but it allowed for a much more modified version of communism to exist, and that actually kind of that was the starter that turned the motor over, and now the motor was able to start running. And once it was able to start running, what happened was, instead of like the US running a deficit, they were running a surplus. They were spending less every year as a nation, and their GDP was creating more. So they all of a sudden have more resources, more money, and they're saying, okay, we know based on looking at other economies that have gone through development over the years that eventually you're going to reach kind of a maximum velocity, or probably more aptly it would be, we're going to reach the eventual need for a policy initiative to correct what could be maybe a recessionary environment, or a slowdown, some kind of economic problem, whatever it is. So at the time, Beijing started seeking out places to park money with a security factor. They weren't going to invest it. They were looking at it as a country at the time, saying, we're growing pretty organically here. We don't need to stimulate our own growth. We don't need to pour money into our own economy, but we want our money to be there in the event we do need to do so. So we don't want to go out and gamble it. We're not going to go to Macau or Vegas and throw the dice with our money. We want to put it somewhere safe. So the average individual here in the US might say they were looking for a CD. They knew they didn't need the money for a period of time, but they also wanted to ensure that they had no loss on that. That was not a investment that was going to be subject to any risk to the downside in favor of potentially getting a higher upside. They said, we'll take whatever upside's available. The most important thing is that we need to make sure that money's available when we have it. And based on inflationary conditions across the globe, we can't just put it in a coffee can out back, and bury it. We need it to at least obtain a marketable rate of return. So they go out to the world and they say, which issuer of debt out here has the highest probability of paying us back? And they go over and they look at all the different countries, and it goes without saying, they see the United States, and they see something very unique about the United States. Not only are they the strongest economy, not only are they, and again, this is the United States we're talking about here, not only is the United States capable of future repayment, at least in their eyes, it's perception, but the United States has something else that's kind of curious. They really, really like China. But they like us because we're giving them something that they don't really like to do. And they're kind of, it's below their pay grade, if you know what I mean. So we're manufacturing a whole lot of things for them. We're using this massive unskilled labor force to build these huge factories. And we're producing all this stuff. And the United States, being pretty developed in its own economic right, they're pretty much a consumer-driven economy. Their potential as a nation is predicated on their ability to spend money. That's what they do best. So they rely on us. So as long as we think we're going to be doing okay, they're still going to be able to pay us back. So now you start to see this is not just a single-edged sword. There's two edges here. Edge number one is the United States has the strongest economy. I want to go to them to park my money. I want to put it somewhere safe. I know I'm going to get it back in the future and I'm going to get an interest rate. Part number two, though, is it's not just safe, it's safe and we have a vested interest in keeping it safe. Because they're also putting food on our table and we're putting all kinds of crap in their houses and cars and devices and this, that, and it, this is pre-cell phone world, but you can start to see this relationship building. All right, so now if we say, okay, China's borrowing the future good faith, but the U.S. is borrowing the spending power today. That's that relationship. China wants to ensure that they have the money accessible in the future. They own the treasuries. They own the U.S. debt. But they need the U.S. to be able to pay them back. They also, as they grow their share percentage, their ownership of the U.S. debt, something really interesting happens. If we look at the stock market, or specifically, let's say, what would be these activist investors, these rogue warriors who have a tremendous amount of money, and they'll go out and they will do like a hostile takeover of a company where they will buy a majority of the shares that are outstanding. So they now become a majority owner of a publicly traded stock. And then they will, with their power that they can now use as influence, they can get a CEO fired because effectively they own the majority of the company. But there's another side to that, which is if they're buying this for future return, they have to be very careful, because once you become a majority owner of something, if you start to sell that something with any significance, if you start to sell a lot, any of the other minority holders of that thing are going, whoa, why are they getting out? And if there's not a clear message as to why, those other investors are probably going to panic and they're going to sell, which is then going to devalue your shares because they're looking to just get out. They don't care what maybe they already have a big return, maybe they don't have a return. They're just saying, I don't want to own this thing anymore. I'm selling. Well, a buyer is going to look and say, well, if you're so interested in selling, sure, I'll give you $3 for your $6 position. And they go, sure, fine, take it. Yeah, whatever. I'll take my $3. I'm out. Well, now that big majority holder who had a $6 per share majority of the shares and it went to $3, they just lost 50% of their value of their money invested in this. So you can see that they have to be very cautious when they're offloading. Well, here we are today. Very similar condition has arisen for China. Remember, when a country is borrowing money, they're issuing a bond, and a bond has a maturity period. So if the owner of the bond says, I can't wait for the maturity period, I want it now, they go to the secondary market. So the primary market is when the US issues the debt and China says, I will buy it directly from you. Great. But now China sits here and says, I'm ready to get rid of this. It's not like the US is mandated to say, okay, I got to give you your money back now, because they said, no. We said 30 years. So China says, I've owned it for 15. Well, I've got 15 years left on this. I've collected X amount of interest, or if it's there's various interest payment, they may have bought it at a discount and it pays in full or whatever. Point being, though, is they now have a marketable security, for lack of a better word, and they have to go and they have to sell it. The buyer is going to go, you're going to have to take a discounted price for it. I'm not going to pay you the full value of that thing. You're going to have to give me something to take that off your hands. And it starts to really compound the issue. Because, again, at the end of the day, America's saying, look, we just know what we have to pay in interest at this point in time. We have to give you your money back and we have to pay interest. They don't care what the premium and the discount would be on that now traded security or that traded thing. So when people start to say China controls the United States because they own all of our debt, I would beg to differ. And I would strongly suggest instead they say, boy, China better hope the United States is doing okay and that they can fulfill their payment. Because here's the two scenarios. Scenario number one, they begin to really powerfully influence the United States to a position where they take over the controls, and the United States, in worst case scenario, the United States spirals out of control. Improbable, but always possible. Well, now all of a sudden they go, oh, okay, I mean, sure, they owe us money, but again, if they spiral out of control into nothing, if we, the United States, it now just prolongs the availability of those monies. If they're not planning on selling the bonds, they're just holding them. They don't want that to happen. They don't want bankruptcy effectively. Scenario number two is they go and start to sell this. And in order to sell it quickly, they're basically going to say, okay, we parked, as a percentage, I'm not going to do the quick calculations, but I'll show you a chart here in terms of how much of the US debt China owns. But if they want to sell out even a third of that, I can assure you, A, they have to find a buyer for it because that's a whole lot. And their countries, no offense to Nicaragua or Chile or, any other country for that matter, they may not even have the money to buy those bonds, even if it's at a huge discount, and they can go, it's the opportunity of a lifetime. They might buy a little bit here and there, but they won't buy all of it. So China has to find the buyer. They have to offload it, and in doing so, Japan, Great Britain, all these other nations who are big shareholders or big owners of this debt, they're going to go, whoa, why is China selling? I'm going to go ahead and hop on out of this too. And now they have to find buyer. So you can start to see it's never going to happen quickly if China wants to do it. But B, there's really no control that China has. China is dependent on the United States having that ability to pay in the future. I am radically oversimplifying this, but in its most basic essence, this is the real relationship here. So it's not a matter of who controls who, it's who's dependent on who. And I would argue that we have a codependency. And where I will, again, as I did in the video one, I want to credit Trump's administration, because even if this is an unknown fringe benefit, even if no one in the policy, in any of the policy wonks even considered this, they probably have, but even if they didn't consider the ancillary benefits of this trade engagement with China, we do have the bargaining chip and the strength when it comes to a negotiation space, especially considering the radical trade imbalance, the policy imbalance, as I mentioned in video one. China in their overall economic system has been fairly protectionist because of their youth as an economy. But they're no longer the kid. They're grown now. And they need to have expectations placed on them as a nation that you got to play by the same rules all the other big kids do. All the other adults do. You're not going to be afforded the, oh, it's okay, they're just an emerging whatever. You got to play by the rules now. I know you've gotten used to having modified relationships where you're not expected to really toe your line. We'll take care of it for you because we can benefit from it. Now it's, look, you're eating at the big table. You're not at the kids' table anymore. You may not like Brussels sprouts. Put them on your plate and eat them, though. That's what's on this table to eat. When the Trump administration began to take a very hardline stance against Beijing, while presidents in the past have not done so, the ancillary benefit is not only potentially curtailing the larger agenda that China has as far as their Belt and Road Initiative, and tightening the, I don't want to say noose, but more the leash, so that China doesn't get a little too big for their own britches. But what they've also done is they've extended to China a reminder of the fact that you need our economy to succeed. You have a control insofar as our tariffs, the things that we do produce that are not consumer driven, the things that you're charging tariffs on, that we are selling you, you have the ability to reduce those and stop being protectionist and allow for the United States to sell to you something that we do have in abundance, typically food. And in response, it's going to ensure that our economy continues its strength. So if you boil down what's going on here, rationale and logic, uncommon sense, is going to take you to the conclusion that more than anything, we really are in a big fat pissing match with China. And forgive me for putting it in that context, but there is no inherent benefit for China trying to play hardball if they're looking at all the pieces in the puzzle. And if they're looking at the ramifications of an attempt to unseat the United States, they actually benefit more by ensuring the United States stays the economic powerhouse. And if they can be comfortable holding the silver trophy into perpetuity, they're going to be just fine. On the assumption that economically all other conditions globally stay about the same. That's where the Belt and Road Initiative becomes such an impactful piece to their puzzle. Because what they're trying to do is ensure that things don't stay the same economically in the global space, thereby allowing them to let their egos fly, or let their desire for dominance have a free ride and not a ride laden with consequences as it currently is. Okay, let's turn the ship around. Now let's focus in on some of the more interesting aspects of how China got to be where they are today. Some of the very critical indicators coming out of China today that would play favor to the idea that the China Foundation, the slab on which China has built its current economy and current status in the global economic landscape, perhaps rather than using 30,000 psi concrete, they're using some straw and maybe some manure and dung to build a castle on. Eventually, it's going to start to sink, and we're starting to see the cracks beginning to show. And they're showing, I say we're beginning to see, not as in the past 2 years. I'm talking over the past 10 years. The cracks are beginning to surface. The question becomes, can the masons get in and patch the cracks as fast as they begin to appear? I want to start with one of those unique tools that a government has, or that a government may have. We talked a little bit about fiscal policy and monetary policy in the United States. We have a Fed that controls the monetary policy. We have congressional decision-making, policy-making, etc. that typically is going to be the primary controller in the fiscal policy space. In China, while fiscal policy is available, being in a communist a governmental landscape, the fiscal policy is much less of a control tool as it is a fundamental element of control. So it's not a lever that can be pulled where we need to do something quick, pull the lever. It's maybe more to the tune of maybe a knob where it's just a matter of dialing. It's not an on and off thing. It's not a, jam it up and let it run and then pull it off like we can with tax cuts and similar. What they're really looking at is they're looking at dialing a knob in. On the monetary side, however, where the United States Fed can control the monetary policy by way of monitoring inflationary information and potentially adjusting the ease of money flow by way of interest rates to hopefully match inflation and interest so that they are self-canceling and they monitor and keep each other in check. That's the theory. By and large, what the Fed does not do, and the U.S., I'm going to say this very loosely, the U.S. does not participate in, is the idea of direct currency manipulation. But China most certainly does. They are very clear. They do manipulate their currency. They are looking to peg their currency, the renminbi, to the U.S. dollar. But it's not a one-for-one peg. What they're looking to do is create a peg at any given time that is beneficial to what their overall agenda is. We saw in 2015, August, go back and look at the markets. At that time, if you were working with an investment advisor, I would reckon to believe you probably called them round about August 24th, 25th. I bet you called them because you woke up and maybe you didn't see it when it first happened, but maybe a week later or 2 days later, whatever it was, you looked at your portfolio and went, what the heck? What's the deal? Okay, what ended up happening in late August of 2015 is the Chinese government opted to significantly devalue their currency. It had, for previous years, leading up to 2015, it had effectively been growing in value, and due in part to their economic growth, due in part to their recovery, because again, American consumers were back to consuming, their economy was growing. Instead of allowing it to fluctuate with the markets, the government came in and said, we're going to devalue the currency, and they did it overnight. Boom. Just like that. What does that do? What occurs when that happens? Well, if one US dollar is, let's just say 2 renminbi, which is the Chinese currency, interchangeably used is the term yuan, to not be confused with Japan's currency, the yen. Let's just call it the renminbi. If $1 is 2 renminbi, let's say on August 15th, 2015. For illustration's sake, it went from 1 to 2 to roughly 1 to 4. So it took now 4 renminbi to buy 1 of the US dollar, but vice versa, 1 US dollar now, instead of only being worth 2 renminbi, is now worth 4 renminbi. So a US consumer now has more purchasing power in the Chinese economy. If you're traveling to China, you go to the exchange desk, you've got your $5 in your pocket, instead of getting 10 renminbi back, again in this hypothetical just for illustration's sake, you're now getting 20. So now you have 20 units of purchasing power available to you on your trip, whereas the day before you had 10. Okay, that will shake up an economy. It will. It will shake up not only a nation's economy, but it will rupture the global economy, because there are entire markets built on currency trades. And if instead of the markets determining valuations of currencies, because there's a supply and demand, there's a buyership and a sellership, now all of a sudden things are just floating along and then disconnect. It sent rattles through the global economy because there were futures contracts outstanding on, let's say I've got a large ship and I am working for a Chinese company, selling whatever product, and that Chinese company wants to ship their product to the United States, and I'm Norwegian, I don't know, a Norwegian shipping company, whatever it is. And I have a futures contract with them where they are paying me in future dollars I have secured because I know what the shipping rate, fuel rates, whatever it is. Now all of a sudden, I had a contract that said I'm going to get paid, again, easy money, 100 renminbi to ship this load of product to to the United States. Well, I'm still going to get paid 100 renminbi. But now my 100 renminbi is worth half as much US dollar. If I'm a shipper, what's one of my biggest costs? Fuel. What's fuel traded in? Dollars. You see how this broke the economy in a very hazardous way in 2015. That's not unusual. And that's a really wild, that's kind of a wild card if you really think about it, that a country can do that. And that's one of those things that Americans have battled with. And there's a lot of economists who would say U.S. needs to go to the table and they need to start we need to directly manipulate our currency to battle this. Going forward, if the government steps out and allows Chinese currency to do what it does, even in the wake of the tariff thing, the trade problem, the disagreements that are going on right now, there's a high probability that they're going to have to cut their valuation again in the future, which could send ripple effects through the market. So, warning number one that you do need to be watching for. And I'm not asking you to go follow the currency markets, but be aware of the fact that there is a high probability within the next 5 years that the Chinese government will take an aggressive stance on manipulating their currency again. And they will devalue it. And that will have a significant impact on the global markets. There's a gentleman by the name of George Magnus. He wrote a book, Red Flags. I'll put a link to it in the description down below. I want to highlight his book because I do think he does a nice job of bringing the fear-mongering narrative that again, our mainstream media is using as a manipulation device to keep the viewership engaged. He does a nice job of unhinging a lot of these and not to look at the situation with rose-colored glasses, but instead look at it as what's really going on here. So I want to point out something else that I think is very, very important. And we can look at our own history as Americans and draw some parallels and see some major differences. So in part one, I brushed over the idea that once upon a time America was this burgeoning powerhouse, this incredibly strong, or at least the potential for becoming incredibly strong, very much existed. There was a shared belief system across the country that allowed America to blossom into what it currently has. And even some of those beliefs that were shared led to competing against one another. That inherently was like fertilizer for the bloom, because it pushed one another to aggressively take an even more progressive stance towards the shared end objective that they were seeking. It's the Tesla Edison thing. It's the, there's a million and one other stories in history that we can look at. But what really set the tone for America's rise to the economic dominance of today can be singularly focused on really two major events. One being the late industrial revolution and the industrialization of America. We had a remarkably diverse population, which with it brought different skill sets. You can look in large cities that have legacy because they've been around for so long and families stayed there. And if I go to Chicago, you can see that there's a very robust Polish community, and many of them are craftspeople, craftsmen, craftswomen. They're out there. They've got talents in the building and construction industry, and they continue to do so today. You go to, the Boston and the New Yorks, and you see the Irish and the Italians. They each have their own skills that they brought through their heritage to those cities, and then bloomed out Pennsylvania. Look at the Pennsylvania Dutch. Look at the craft work. You can go to Stone Home Country there in like Bucks County, Pennsylvania, and look at these gorgeous old farm homes. But all these different talents and skills came from different places. And that mixing bowl of viewpoints and talents and skills, I've said in my first video, is one of our greatest strengths. It really is. Anyway, the U.S. eventually grew into the powerhouse it is, but the defining moment, in addition, again, to the first being the diversity and the late Industrial Revolution, leading to this remarkable ability for this country to not only innovate, but innovate and produce high quality manufactured products for the world to enjoy and for the U.S. to enjoy. So that's part one. Part two came in the 40s, because we ended up having a very significant global conflict, World War II. While the war and the United States' impact on the war, the overall resolution to the war, well, all that's great and wonderful. What really occurred after the war was the birth of the middle class. For many of those who are wanting to point fingers at the past and bark about how things have slipped into decay today, that wealth distribution is concentrated in the hands of the few today, I'd strongly encourage you, go back and please take a look at, to the best of your ability, an unbiased history of where things were in pre-war times, pre-World War II times, because things were very much at that time, it was a matter of there was people and the upper class. There were really not people in between. World War II occurs, and now not only has a vast majority of the population who hadn't previously worked in factories, who hadn't previously been capable of manufacturing or producing or innovating because they were never exposed to it. A lot of women came into the workforce. Huge economic stimulus. Because they stayed in the workforce after the war. But they were not only exposed to something, so, if I were to tell you, what's the best way to cut a mortise and tenon for a piece of furniture, and you've never held a handsaw, let alone a hammer or a table saw or, a router or whatever, you're not going to really be able to sit there and say, oh, I can improve on this, or I can tell you the best way to do it. But if you get exposed to it, now all of a sudden you have that basic knowledge, and it allows for you as a creative individual, as we all have the capacity to be, it allows for you to go out there and explore and think about new alternatives, new ways to do something. That occurred. And then you had this blossom, you had this eruption of this new middle class. This new middle class was built on not only the idea that you had all these new entrants to the economy, these people working that hadn't worked before, but you also had these people coming back from something that created a true unity for the country. They were all on the same team together. Because as Ronald Reagan, I think, was he had once said something to the effect of, while we might be enemies with the Russians, I'd be likely to believe we'd all become friends if an alien, if a malicious alien race came to the Earth tomorrow. That idea where when you have a shared enemy, it breaks down some of those pre-existing barriers between one another, and you end up getting the brotherhood and sisterhood, the type of healthy nationalism. And while you hate to think that a war is what is required to develop that, we can at least see from the evidence it is at least one way to develop that. And because of that, this middle class, there was I'm not going to help you out because I'm told by the government I have to, or I'm not going to help you out because I'm being forced to pay the government something, and then in turn they're going to decide what to do with that money. There were people who were helping each other out because they were on the same team. They were people who didn't seek out wealth for the sake of status and wealth, but they sought out success and benefit so that they could not expose their next of kin and their friends and whatever to the atrocities that they had previously been exposed to, or maybe it was something with World War I, maybe it was something with the Great Depression, whatever it was. We can go on and on philosophically about all the things that would have brought people together, but the fact is that people came together and they now had a reason to work, and they had skills to work, and they had the ability and the desire to work because they were building something together and they felt that. So a middle class emerges, and a middle class is really good at one specific thing: spending money. So here's where things get interesting with China. While the United States' path to economic dominance is not the only way. Again, if we look at it, conditions globally are so much different today than they even were 10 or 15 years ago. It might require a completely different path to reach a state of dominance. But one thing, at least in today's economic landscape, that we see to be a very critical component, it's that a nation's wealth stability is predominantly dictated by the wealth of the general population. Now, this presents some very interesting challenges as far as the United States goes, due in part to the fact that we are seeing ourselves as a country, at least currently, sliding into a more concentrated wealth imbalance, or the wealth is becoming more concentrated into the hands of few as opposed to the once upon a time middle class that we talked about. I firmly believe that this is much a symptom of what I suggested earlier as a negative to our approach for policy making, which is the Fed and the Federal Reserve's ability to control interest rates the way that they do, and the fact that leaving the Great Recession, the rates were suppressed and held so low for so long, I think was a massively contributing factor to what ended up creating the wealth imbalance today. And the short end of it is, the closer you are to the spigot, the cheaper money is. And if money's really cheap for just about everyone, it's next to free for those who have a position closer to the spigot, or those with more influence and power. And therefore, if you have free money, that's risk-free money, is another way you can look at that. So you can go out and take risk with someone else's money without a cost. And there's a lot of nuance in this, but it most certainly did not detract from the wealth concentration that we're beginning to see today. And the other big thing is, when you've suffered a massive loss and someone else has suffered a massive loss, if your massive loss is a 50% cut and you had $10 and it's down to $5, it might be hard to put a plate of food in front of you. But someone else's massive 50% loss may have been going from 10 million to 5 million. They're probably still eating and have excess money to then do something with it. So it's not just in the hands of the Fed, but I do believe that the Fed's decision making created a lot of what we're seeing today. But back to China. If we can agree that the middle class wealth is a necessity to create a stable growth opportunity as a nation, China's at a significant disadvantage. And that is because while, yes, the United States has begun seeing a significant concentration in the overall wealth of its citizens, China has undoubtedly seen this. And what's more, while the United States built its economic dominance on the shoulders of the middle-class consumer, and that is in turn the middle-class earner, the middle-class innovator, the middle-class worker, China and their rapid exponential growth over the past several years has been, by and large, rooted solely in investment. It has not been organic in nature. It has been very much a controlled growth. When we see where China's wealth is right now, I personally see massive cracks in the foundation. And I see a lot of new cracks beginning to form every single day. If we look at history, we can see that once upon a time, China's economy was actually built on the consumer and the rise of what at the time was becoming to be, or what was turned into, a middle class. But we can see here, this has changed dramatically. They are no longer an economy built on a population that is capable of consuming. They are built on a very different plan and blueprint. And if this isn't remedied, what you end up having here is a concentration not only of wealth and power, but if I were to use the analogy of, let's just say, an athlete of some sort, and if that athlete's attempting to keep their balance, we know, spread the legs and bend the knees. Widen your stance and bend your knees. It's a lot harder to push you over. You stand with your heels and ankles together and straight up. Somebody comes and pushes you, it's going to be very hard for you to keep your balance. That's why the pyramid is such a remarkably strong structure, and it can endure big, strong, fat base, and then it goes up. The inverted pyramid, however, not so strong. If we look at the wealth in the same context, it's much easier for concentrated control and wealth to topple than it is for a diversified, spread wealth. So, as we look ahead at China's future, if we're able to monitor the condition of their middle class, and not only the condition of their middle class, but the percentage of their GDP that is rooted in the consumption capability or the consumption capacity of their population, we're going to be able to, I think, have, for all intents and purposes, two fingers right on the pulse. And that's going to give us an indication as to whether or not this particular country is moving towards more dominance or less dominance. If the Chinese policymakers and decision makers seek to reach what they are planning to reach, they're going to have two different avenues they can go down. One is positive for the population, beneficial, and should be pretty scary for the Americans, for anyone here in the States who would like to believe that we stay where we are and that we in fact reinvigorate our own middle class. But the other avenue is a bit more bleak and dire, and I'm currently seeing a lot of signals that would point to that. And I'll break down the path that I think they're going on in part 3. So be sure to stay tuned in. And until then, thank you so much for sticking with me today as I broke down for you the debt and deficit conversation, whether or not China has any control over the United States. Again, I would suggest that they have far less control than the mainstream media would offer you. I think that China has a vested interest in ensuring that the United States retains a majority, if not all, of its current strength and status. The United States, however, may shoot itself in the foot as it continues down the path it does with the internal policy making with Congress and their fiscal decision making. If Congress can't figure out a better way to spend, meaning less, we might have our own problems whether China wants to help us or not. We also talked a little bit about how the American middle class is such a critical piece to our own history, and how China doesn't have that middle class strength as it goes down the road that America once walked down. And while they do show tremendous strengths in many other facets of their own economy, what I genuinely believe is one of the most foundational and fundamental pieces of their puzzle, it is currently missing. And until I see that begin to surface, or if it ever does, I'm not going to be so worried about the United States losing its dominance to China. So with that, as I mentioned in the beginning, if you liked today's video, click the like button. If you haven't watched part 1, take some time to go do so. And if you're not already a subscriber, I know these videos are long, I know that you might have had your eyes glazed over, but if you happen to be one who enjoys the critical thinking aspects of all of these working pieces in this wacky, wild world we live in, you may have enjoyed this exploration today, and you might have some thoughts of your own. If you do, how do you feel about the current debt and deficit situation, specifically as it relates to China's control over the U.S. by having a significant portion of the debt? What are your thoughts on the Chinese middle class? What do you believe the role of the middle class is in today's world? Do you think it still has the same impact and power that it once did? And the thing I didn't even break the surface of, what do you think about patriotism? Do you think that that is an immeasurable but critical part of any country's ability to advance in their own right towards some form of political, economic dominance? Let me know what you think down below in the comments. And again, if you haven't subscribed already, subscribe to the channel, and we'll look forward to seeing you again real soon with part 3. Have a great day.